Oh, okay. Welcome, everybody. This panel is on government and science fiction, and we're here today. There's a few administrative things I want to go over before we start the panel. Everybody, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a button there for chat, and that runs a script that you run, and it runs continuously, top to bottom. On the right side, you'll see Q&A. This is where you will type in the questions you want the panel or individual on the panel to address, and we will address those toward the end of the panel discussion instead of interrupting the discussion. Just a note to everybody that be careful about your language. This session is being recorded, and anything you say will be held for posterity, so don't embarrass yourselves on this. Let our panel introduce themselves, go around this. Start with Alex.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Wittenberg. I am a longtime science fiction and fantasy fan. I have been in fandom a bit more than 20 years. I've been attending Balticons for about 8 years. I have no particular expertise in this subject outside of the fact that I live in a society and have a government.
Thank you, Alex. Ted?
Hi, everyone. I'm Ted Weber. I'm a speculative fiction author, among other things. The first two books of my cyberpunk trilogy, Sleep State Interrupt and Wrath of Leviathan, can be found online, and the finale will be released September 1st. They're mostly set in a near future America with a corrupt government with universal surveillance and no regard for civil rights. Hard to imagine, I know, but I guess that's why I'm here. So in the plot, the protagonists try to stop a giant media corporation and corrupt politicians from controlling the world.
Thank you, Ted. Arkady?
Hi, I'm Arkady Martine. I'm a speculative fiction writer, and in my day job, I actually work in politics. I'm a policy advisor for the state of New Mexico's Energy, Minerals, and Natural Resources Department. My first novel, this one, is set in a giant interstellar empire. It's a space opera. And have always been kind of obsessed with systems of government and the difference between bad and good kings and whether you can get the second kind. So that's me.
Thank you, Arkady. Day?
Day, you're muted.
It's a good thing that was muted. You guys did not hear the little cursing there. So hi, my name is Day Al-Mohamed. I'm an author, filmmaker, also a policy advisor, actually. Only I'm with the federal government, currently with the U.S. Department of Labor. My actually most recent novella is The Labyrinth's Archivist, which is actually in more of a fantasy setting, but I've had 10 years with labor, and then about 15 years before that actually as a lobbyist for government, or I don't want to say against, but basically ideas as a lobbyist going, how do I get what I want out of government? So for basically different groups who hired me.
I bet we'll have a lot to talk about both here and offline.
Thank you, Day. Let me start off with, give you an idea of my interpretation of the panel description. We're going to discuss works of fiction that do politics right or wrong, and how we envision or build fictional governments based on transformative technology, social changes, alien or non-human civilizations, which leaves us a big, big, big gap to fill. And we only have an hour. So this is something we could easily take a week to do. So who wants to start off the discussion? Okay, before the panel started, we talked about explicit versus implicit government roles in fiction. And I used the Starship Troopers and as an example of explicitly political work of fiction.
And then you also mentioned 1984, which isn't necessarily science fiction, but definitely speculative fiction. It's set, the protagonist is a minor functionary in the government, and it's all about the government because the purpose of the book was to illustrate the ultimate totalitarian system in which the government is control of every single aspect of human existence, using propaganda and surveillance and even rewriting history. And Orwell was inspired by Stalinist USSR, which used all those same techniques, and he was worried about the same thing happening to Britain. I think he started it during World War II, and he was afraid that that would happen to Britain. So, and then implicit is where the government is just sort of in the background and isn't really mentioned much. Like a lot of fantasy works are like that, where they just kind of have a feudal system, but they don't really dwell on it much. It's just, about what the nobles are up to and the wars that they have, and that sort of thing always bothers me because, it focuses on the nobility when the vast majority of people were the serfs, and they were just one step up from being slaves. But those sorts of works generally don't go into explicitly how things are governed.
I think that I agree, Ted, but I also think that that implicit political systems in science fiction and fantasy and speculative fiction in general aren't necessarily a cop-out. And they aren't necessarily not a way to talk about politics in a work of speculative fiction. I think that you can see I'm trying to think of a really good example. I think I mentioned this on an earlier panel. Elizabeth Bear's most recent science fiction novel, Ancestral Night, which came out last year, is on the surface a book about basically alien artifact hunters and really bad relationship decisions. But hidden inside it, and not very deeply inside it, is a exploration of a system of government which is neither democratic nor autocratic. And that system of government and its consequences on how the people who are living inside it determine right and wrong action, determine morality, determine how punishment for breaking the law works, all influence the plot in really serious and deep ways. And that kind of implicit use of politics to shape plot and character is one of the things that I think speculative fiction can do really well, because we can play with systems of government which we don't live in or see or have never existed, and see what the consequences would be on people living their lives.
Yeah, it's a choice between whether the government is mediating the actions or whether it's a moral code that they're all adhering to. And often people can't tell the difference. Alex?
I think that because science fiction books in general tend not to be slice of life or, literary fiction, you can have a novel by like a John Updike type, and the government is just off in the background because it's the government we all know. In most science fiction books, the existence of a government is often there implicitly, even if it doesn't affect things directly, just because there's almost like this obligation put on the writer or the creator to explain something about the future. I can't think of an instance where you have a science fiction novel that is set in a future America where the system is exactly the same and it never comes up. I'm sure some examples of that exist, but I think it's almost part of the DNA of science fiction, even if you're not actually exploring the politics of the government of the time, that you are going to put something in that suggests what the government or the politics of the time is like.
Okay. Do you have anything to say?
I was just processing kind of on that last statement, because I'm trying to go through the books as quickly as I had in my head, and I think there's something to that, maybe in so much as it, rewind, in that when reading science fiction, there is an expectation that the shaping of a future that the government has a very large hand in that. How about that? And that, so when we end up writing about it, we end up putting that in, whether explicitly or implicitly, because there's an expectation, or there's a, yeah, I mean, there really is. There's an expectation that that has to play some sort of a role in that, in that. And we can always say, yeah, well, of course, we always talked about governments and how they've shaped things in the past, and we can talk about travel and colonies and things like that. But you know, I'm thinking about some of the historical stuff. I'm like, yeah, they'll include government stuff in some of those, but for some of the science fiction, even in some of the smaller pieces, there's always at least some faint mention. And I wonder if there's that expectation that going into a future, that influence is so prevalent you can't do without it. So, like I said, it's half processed thoughts. Sorry, you guys.
Yeah, well, that's what we're here for. Alex?
I'm just thinking about, well, it's a small part in the Verkosigan books, which are very political. There is the occasional reference to the world that Cordelia is from, which is ostensibly a democracy. And on the rare occasions anyone talks about the government, the comment is, well, I didn't vote for him. So it's like this is little background noise for a system that I think is supposed to be close to ours, as opposed to the main systems you see in there. But it is definite background noise that kind of gives you a setting for the entire world, that at some level, this nearly utopian world, people are still scratching their heads about how things are run.
Yeah, you can infer the type of government, or at least something about how the society is run, just by observing the setting and characters in the story. You know, for example, are there a wealthy elite and then everyone else is poor? Or do people have to kind of take care that they're not being watched and things like that? Or is everyone doing fairly well, though that wouldn't make a very exciting story? So yeah, that would be kind of implicit.
I think in response to what Day was saying, that there is this, I agree, there is this assumption that gets built into the DNA of science fiction as a genre, especially, and I'm only speaking for Anglophone science fiction here because I'm not familiar enough with science fiction in other traditions to really speak about it, though I suspect it's equally present in Russian science fiction, some of which I've read in translation, is the idea that the form of government that a society has is one of the strict determiners of its future. And I think that comes out of the late 20th century Cold War communist capitalist sense of what kind of government a society has is going to shape whether it has a good future or a bad future, which is kind of deeply written into the story America tells itself. And I think also the story that the UK tells itself. And as science fiction in America and in the UK grew over the 20th century, that base idea that government tells you what kind of future you get is so deeply written in that it's almost unconscious. I mean, this is the first time I've actually verbalized this to myself, and I've been reading this my whole life.
I think one of the things that that gets in the way of a lot is that very few works of fiction deal with more than two types of government at a time. And there are, look at the world today. We've got at least 20 different kinds of government in there, all of which seem to work terribly, including democracy, which is the worst idea of all. Nobody's come up with anything better, though. So I'm getting more at examples where the government influences the plot more, instead of being directly about the government, what the government's doing, but it influences the actions of all the participants.
I just wanted to mention real quick, it's been a very long time since I've read the Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, but it looks at 3 different government types. There's an anarcho-syndicalist utopia on the moon world, and then on the main world there's a capitalist patriarchy, and then there's a socialist dictatorship. And those are supposed to be kind of symbolic of the US and the Soviet bloc at that time, and then with the alternative out there, you know, on the moon being a anarcho-syndicalist society, which both the capitalists and the Soviets despised, that sort of government.
So I was so thinking on the idea of that explicit versus implicit, and I think some of that comes down to the idea of what you're writing. Like, if you think about science fiction as an environment, and Arkady, you said what you wrote was a space opera, right? I've always tended to look at the ones with very explicit governmental stories. I'm like, that's a political thriller in space, or a political thriller in the future. So when I see a lot more government stuff, that's the style of story that's being told within a science fiction environment. So it's kind of one of those, it's almost like that subgenre, whereas the idea of the impact of government and the expectation and assumptions of government shows up as implicit, insofar as I think it covers a wider swath within science fiction, because, like I said, it's back to the assumption that it has to be there. And I love that point, because I just want to say, yeah, absolutely, what is one of our biggest exports? Democracy is the biggest export of America. And you can go back to some of the World War II posters and some of the Cold War posters, and that is a very, very clear as a part of the mission.
If only we would practice it.
Yeah. I mean, when I personally am describing my books, I call them political thrillers in space. The genre marketing that got attached to them, which has been very successful, so I'm not going to object to it, was space opera, which I think may have helped people who don't sit around reading Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy as comfort reading like I do, think that they might enjoy the book also.
It's an awesome book.
Thank you.
I don't know if everybody's noticed it yet, but we just passed 107 participants in this panel, which is by the largest audience I've had.
That's the largest audience I've ever spoken to. I never get that many at actual presence. I've been rereading the Foundation books, and those are political non-thrillers. I'm enjoying them, but as Asimov himself admits in the preface he wrote in the 80s, these are books where a lot of talk happens and there's not a ton of action, and people seem to enjoy that anyway. But they are implicitly political, and we're following the path of collapsing empire and what's rising to replace it. And it's also just interesting that there's nothing democratic going on, or if there is, it kind of fades quickly. It's we have this empire that's about to collapse that is quasi-hereditary, and then the Foundation comes along and it's democratic until it becomes hereditary, and all the action pivots around that and uses that as a jumping off point for other kinds of storytelling. I mean, by the end of Second Foundation, we're kind of just having an adventure story, which is a lot of fun. And I just think, he admits that he was jumping off Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. So he's telling an implicitly political story that is also actually an historical story. I don't know how deeply you can analyze the politics to it, but I just find it fascinating. He sort of is one of a lot of science fiction writers who use non-democratic forms of government and then uses monarchy. That I can see that you could say that democracy is always going to be fragile, and there always will be some form of dictatorship. But I found it fascinating, and he was writing these in the 40s and 50s and looking at a future where there would still be kings, when by that point on Earth, monarchy had already almost completely vanished.
I think to have a functioning democracy, you have to have a strong rule of law to keep, and then also a divided system to make it difficult for one person or one faction to gain dictatorial powers. It's still possible, but it's harder when you have a divided system, especially a federalist system. Like, you know, I criticize the U.S. government sometimes, but it's the pandemic has shown that a federal system can work if you have dysfunction at the top. You know, we have states that are still going on forward and address the pandemic on their own. And so where you have a sort of divided government, I think you need, in short, a divided government and a strong rule of law to maintain democracy. And participation, citizen
To
participation.
sort of jump off that, I don't think that voting equals democracy, or that, and that's that's one of the things that I think that can show up in not just speculative fiction, but all sorts of fiction in general, where there's this, and in real life political work, the idea that voting equals democracy, and it doesn't. Voting that is an accurate representation of the opinions of all of the people under a particular government is sort of my slapshod basic democratic definition. And that happens extremely rarely. In fact, I can't think of one that exists at the moment.
One of the things that always fascinated me is there's a lot of writing in science fiction about interstellar empires, case in point on here, spanning star systems. They all seem to kind of ignore the fact that these things are really, 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 really far away. And it takes a lot of time to get around there. So you've got representational democracies are kind of impossible to have in that system. You might have a number of local dictatorships. You might have some anarchy in other places and so forth. But there has to be some sort of mediation going on in order to hold a cohesive civilization.
Unless you have some sort of communication device like an Ansible where you can communicate instantaneously, which there's no current physics support for, but that's same for faster than light travel.
Yeah, but that's sort of stretching things. That's sort of like imagining there's something like faster than light travel.
I think we actually see a surprisingly good examination of what a galactic republic would be like in the Star Wars prequels and the Clone Wars animated series, because whether George Lucas knew how to get there or not, we're seeing these meetings of a Senate that has thousands upon thousands of worlds, and it's an incredibly dysfunctional government. And you know, we know in the end it becomes an empire, and it's a little heavy-handed, a little cartoonish. But there are times where the Clone Wars series sort of looks at the fact that it's just unwieldy, and everybody is constantly pivoting to get advantages, and it's a difficult fight. And while it is far distance from democracy, it kind of does show the difficulties of bigger representative government, even if it does it in a way that's not particularly subtle or advanced or necessarily even intelligent.
You know, I think the question is whose ox gets gored and whose gets to survive. It's civilization as a whole. In order to be, we're social animals, and there's always give and take within however small a tribe you happen to have. If it's a gazillion people, you have a little more interactions than going on than you have in your family, although with no less anger involved. So you have to have some sort of mediating influence. You have to have a set of basic fundamental laws that everybody adheres to and understands that they are necessary in order for the entire society to function. Am I going off the deep end here?
No, I think it applies to all forms of government, not just the ones that people invent in speculative fiction. Without that sense of shared reality, you have something that is easily breakable and difficult to deal with. see under the current United States.
You're talking about fragility, I think.
Yeah, fragility, but also the ability to maintain rule of law and common social norms. If people don't think that the same, if people aren't living in the same kind of shared epistemological universe, where a series of events mean the same thing to people, then it's really difficult to get them to believe in the same sort of government and the same kind of laws, because facts don't mean the same thing. But I don't want to talk about how frustrated I am with the current state of my country.
Even at a smaller scale, I mean, even at the smallest scale, even within a family, opinions differ dramatically, and you could have people with completely different worldviews, in the same family, but they still have to get along. Maybe they don't get along, but it would be better if they did.
I think, and I think maybe that's part of the reason it is so tempting, and why a lot of folks who are writing that kind of science fiction tend to lean towards the idea of an empire or more autocratic leaders, because it simplifies the issue a little bit. It makes it very easy to go, well, most people are following along this kind of path, and from a good or bad practical standpoint, we could argue, all right, so let's talk about some of the space advances that we've had within the US, right? Some of the first big jumps came from very charismatic individual leaders, right? So we had Kennedy talking about a man on the moon. We had Reagan caught up in the paranoia of with the Russians and the space race. And so a lot of the big moves came from individual pushes, even within these other broader systems. And so in some ways, I think we tend to gravitate towards something like that. One, it makes it a little simpler, but two, as far as forward momentum, a lot of that comes from you can find a lot more from an individual push than when you have that push-pull more broadly. And part of it just may simply be because there's whether you like it or not, there's efficiencies, good and bad, within those kinds of systems.
A lot of that might be misinterpretation by especially authors of history books. I'm talking about like high school history. So you get the idea that history is made by a handful of noteworthy people, when in actuality advances usually come from movements below that have been take a long time. Like civil rights, for example, that wasn't Lyndon Johnson. That was decades of movement building and agitation that forced it that way. Same-sex marriage, that wasn't Joe Biden and Barack Obama. That was something that had been building for decades. And I think that's the environmental movement. So we can't forget that broad-scale social movements tend to start outside of government. Sometimes they start within, but I think more often outside, because governments are usually instruments of the status quo.
I think
As
everybody
someone in-
needs to understand that, excuse me, Arkady. I think everybody
sorry.
needs to understand that most of the government forms we're suffering under or working under today are accidents of history. Things happen that change things. Laws are made all the time. They're changed. There's a reaction to everything that's in one direction, it pulls it in the other. And there's this great leveling that takes place over decades and all. It isn't apparent at any one point, but eventually at the end of it, you look back and say, why didn't we do this to begin with? So I think we have to look on governments as evolving creatures, not as something that's fixed in time and space, but it's something that people will adapt to and make changes to based on what they want to see in their own life.
Yeah, I agree. And I wanted to pull something that I just saw scroll back through chat. sort of in response to what Ted was saying about the great man theory of history, which you're absolutely right, is pretty much not how history works, but is, and the thing that was interesting in chat was someone brought up that it is a really useful narrative tool. And it's a lot easier to write, to have a single person or a group of people having substantive, real effects on the shape of the future. And as writers, that's something that is easy to reach for. It's a lot harder to write a good story about an incremental democratic process, or an incremental anarcho-syndicalist process. I actually find that one even harder to do because I've never lived there. So, so there is, I think, this pressure when we are telling stories, especially stories about pivotal moments in a future history or an imagined history, to focus on the types of governments or the types of moments in the interaction between government and individual where it looks like an individual is making a big change, because that's easy storytelling. It's not the only kind of storytelling. And again, I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm working in a Western tradition that tends to focus on individual action. Yeah. But I think that is something that, as we're thinking about this, both in terms of analysis of lived politics that we live in as human beings on Earth, and written politics that we create or experience as writers and readers, the pressures are different.
I wrestled with that in my cyberpunk trilogy, where the main character, Whaley, decides that she wants to, for personal reasons, mostly to bring down this giant media corporation that's controlling everything. And so at first she thinks that she can create this trigger event and then things will just change, and she learns that was totally unrealistic. So then it becomes a case of having to bring in these other I don't know, these other groups of people and sort of creating a movement. And a lot of that stuff happens in the background. And so I have to have on one hand, I have to have the protagonists be the change agents for the plot. But on the other hand, I wanted to show that one person or just a handful of people can't change something as gigantic as a world system by themselves. They have to plug into it, and there has to be systems of feedback, and this feedback has to keep growing until it's too big to stop. So that it took me a while to I don't know, work that out. But you're right, it's not easy.
And there's the opposite tendency in a lot of books to sort of romanticize the unrealistic concepts of one person can change everything. Or, I mean, going back to the Verkosigan books, we had the world of Bariar, which is more or less completely undemocratic, and we've got this emperor he's a fascinating character, and he's just sort of pushing the buttons and moving the levers and moving the world towards a better place. And it's fun, and the characters are all interesting, but it's like this magic great man at the top who 5 books earlier ran away from the job. So he's like, I don't even know how he got from point A to point B. And then this other character who is also pushing all the levers. And Miles Verkosigan is a fascinating character, but he isn't necessarily somebody that we'd want to have in the real world.
Anybody would comment on that?
I do think that there are people who do have outsized effects, but they're usually more localized than it can even appear while they're happening. I'm thinking of someone like Nancy Pelosi. who probably in 75 years will be an interesting figure in history. But right this moment feels like someone who has her hands on some of those levers. Not maybe as much as some people would like, maybe more than some people would like. But there are people who are, by virtue of where they are placed by privilege or luck or hard work or all three, who can, for a narrow scale, have outsized immediate influence. But as Bud was saying, there's this, if we look at the long durée, the time in which those powerful immediate lever pulling influences have major effects is relatively localized. Everything kind of smooths out slowly over time.
You can have charismatic and very talented leaders like Martin Luther King and Mahatma Gandhi, who did not build movements by themselves, but they were key to bringing it, across the goal line, or at least one of the goal lines anyway. So yeah, individuals can definitely make a difference, but individuals can't do much by themselves on a large scale, because so I used to work for the state of Maryland state government, and so I know how some bureaucracies work there. It's like changing something is like changing a super tanker, changing the course of a super tanker. It's going to take a long, long time.
So I'm going to go back then. So we're talking about an individual within a narrow scope, and we've given some, and you guys have given some examples, some very well-known names. And I think one of those things I think that's related to that, especially when we talk about the way we write history, right? It's what we learn from the books. Things get boiled down to it because it's easy for us to understand, it's easy for us to follow, but you could also look at some of it to some extent for some of those folks with regard to the fact that having a figurehead to some extent gives a focus, right? And giving a focus to some movements is specifically what's needed to be able to drive some of those things forward. And I'm thinking about, and then there are many multiple reasons, but I'll push for the Occupy movement. It's a movement. It was a movement. It has lots of people, but without and this is where I'm like, this is clearly an opinion here. The idea of having an individual or group or specific planks to focus on actually helps make a difference and make it easier to move things forward. And I think that's part of things like some of the civil rights movement, some of those other things and like I said, it's easier to write it backwards in history. But as far as human nature goes, those are the kind of things that we end up looking to, is we end up looking to movements and symbols. And those have been a very big part, at least as far as speaking very specifically to Western and specifically, actually, we could argue, I would say American culture, right? And even goes down to the idea of the flag, and why flag burning is such a big deal here, because the symbolism of it specifically, whereas half a dozen other countries, the idea of the flag is attached to whatever government is, and so the idea of flag burning has not really as big of an impact in many of those. So I'm like, I still remember when I came here not understanding why it was such a big deal. I'm like, no, protesters do it all the time where I come from. It's whereas here it's steeped so much that the idea of kneeling at a football game is controversial, and that's the idea of what is government, what is state, and what are symbols, and how important those are, and how it relates to it. And that also, I think, I'm not making it clear connecting all the pieces, so I'm just going to throw it there as a melange and go here.
Yeah, the Occupy movement is a great example of a decentralized movement that it brought attention to something we all know but didn't pay attention to because the media didn't pay attention to, which is wealth inequality, and they shone a light on it. So kudos. And it wasn't one single person leading that. It was very organic and decentralized.
One thing that's been brought up by a couple people, I think it was Arkady, was talking about the great man principle, the person who all the changes in society or government of that era are ascribed to that individual instead of being a group. The thing to remember is that the great man that's affecting changes is still working inside a system, and usually has to be within the political system that he belongs to, he is no more able to get outside of that system to suggest something different than anyone else. And so when you talk about changing the system itself, let's say going from a democracy to a parliamentary form of government, that requires some sort of external force and probably a hell of a lot of internal agreement on how to get there from here on there. I think back on Mac Reynolds, who was a short fiction writer in the 1950s and 60s and all. He wrote a number of little pieces in there about sabotaging the big government by doing little things. I think The Wasp was one of his little stories where he was etching the figure of the wasp in political slogans on storefront windows. And everybody was so disrupted about this that they lost track of the actual rebellion that was building. It's an interesting story. Arkady, you wanted to say something. Did I cut you off?
I'm sure I did, and I don't remember what it was. So clearly either it will come back to me or it wasn't important.
Okay, we're getting clear at the end. There's a bunch of questions here that have been scrolling up as we've been talking. The first one was the one that really caught my attention, and maybe you're the best person to answer this, Arkady. Do you see any recent books that may be as influential as 1984 or Dispossessed?
I am not the best person to answer this because my answer is we don't know what the most influential book currently will be until it's had time to be influential. You can ask that question about the most influential political piece of speculative fiction in the year 2020, in the year 2040. And you might get some decent answers at that point.
God help us, in 500 years, somebody says, you know, Terry Pratchett wrote this really influential book. Stephen Ryder asked a question. If it's logical to assume the increased ability of big data forces, there has to be someone who is head of that data processing that extracts what information it is. So who else besides the government would be able to equitably operate such a thing? I'm thinking about present day China, which is ubiquitous surveillance society.
The more decentralized, the better. The original vision for the internet was a decentralized system where people could interact without there being censorship or commercial demands, which of course is not what it is now. And so my trilogy takes it to the ultimate level where one corporation becomes so powerful that they take over the whole thing and control all information. So that's what we want to avoid is information monopolies like and great firewalls like China has. But I think that those sorts of things are like the Great Firewall. It's not going to last forever because the more bandwidth we need, the more undersea cables will be needed, the more points of entry have to be monitored. Also, the more people interact directly. I'm also thinking peer-to-peer communication. Those things, peer-to-peer communication, especially using encrypted apps like onion routers, those are extremely difficult for governments to control. And so where you have government control, things evolve to get around it, and you end up with a sort of we're in a sort of arms race now. So right now we're in the totalitarian model may have ascendance in parts of the world, but it's not complete. I think I might have gone off on a tangent here, but.
Another question by Ed Sabel, which is really related to the one about who would take care of analyzing and presenting and operating on that dip, is would that inevitably lead to a benevolent AI sort of thing?
I don't think that we have any idea what AIs that become independent of human control will want. So I'm working on a story now that I kind of posited that AIs won't have human emotions at all, but they will have their own emotions like curiosity and self-survival, and they may decide that humans are a threat and get rid of us all, or they may co-opt us or make us, which is probably more likely. But as far as a benevolent AI, on one hand, if you have an AI that's controlled, it's controlled by people. People are never completely benevolent, and if you have some people who are benevolent, at some point, they more likely than not, they'll be replaced by someone that is less benevolent. And then if it's just the AI by itself, we have no idea what motives it would create for itself. And it wouldn't be the same type of thinking and emotion that we would have, because it doesn't have our evolved lizard brain emotions.
I think there's a difference between the question of what will AI look like, which is in many ways a technological question, and what kinds of automated data use might take the place of government functions, which is actually a question about algorithms and algorithmic design. Which I think is much more, it's already here and much more likely to be a major factor in the next 20, 30, 40 years of human governance than a hypothetical conscious, quote unquote, artificial intelligence. Algorithmic design can imitate various forms of consciousness rather well, but with deeply implicit bias because it is built by a human and therefore reflects that human. They're like weird mirrors, which I find fascinating and explore some in the fiction I write, but I also sometimes want to skip all that and just write non-human AIs that talk, because I like the trope and there's a certain amount of pure storytelling enjoyment in that. But that's like talking about I sort of consider them the science fiction equivalent of minor gods in fantasy. There's an equal amount of, we don't know how this works, but it does.
Do you see robo-judges in our future?
Define robo-judges?
So where the lawyers take, and they may be robo-lawyers, take the case before the court, and it's decided by a computer.
Probably, and I hope not.
We're not willing to let robots umpire baseball games. If we're not going to let them do that, I don't think we're going to let them do anything.
We've got about 2 minutes to go right here. So let's wrap up. Alex, do you have any final thoughts?
Final thoughts on this topic are impossible because it grows out of our own lives. You know, science fiction about government, implicit or explicit, and about politics is about us. I do want to throw in one thing because I saw someone asking a question about an example of a science fiction story where there's media involved. The comic book series Transmetropolitan about good old Spider Jerusalem, who basically brings down a government using the power of the media. And it might be wishful thinking on the part of Warren Ellis. It might be a template for how to bring down a government, but that is just a great series that addresses government. And for the most part, while it's a science fictional world, the politics are our politics, for good and for bad. So it might be worth people's time to read it if they want to get a good place for science fiction addresses politics and government.
Yeah, I think that's a good separation there, getting government and politics separated. So we're talking about two different things. Ted?
Yeah, like Alex said, it's very hard to sum up in 30 seconds or so. Just that governments are made of people that are operating from, their like a shared value system. Governments change over time, societies change over time. question is, do we want to do it sustainably in such a way that this isn't something that we talked about, but you know, societies are also constrained by available resources, and we are destroying all of our resources. So that may, you know, rule out prosperous societies in the future for a long time unless we change course.
Arkady?
I mean, yes, can we please work more on solving climate change? That would be nice. But in terms of final thoughts on this topic, I think that for me, I want to mention again, and I think I've said this on like almost every panel I've been on this weekend, is that government is a technology, and politics is a technology. In the really old sense of techne, a tool that is used as an art. And when we think of science fiction and speculative fiction as ways of exploring the influences of one or another possible technologies, we should include politics and government in that sphere and scope.
Okay.
I think this is probably going to be more wishful thinking on my part as it relates to the real world and science fiction, which is when looking at portrayals and of I guess what democracy looks like. And this is where I think Arkady mentioned the idea of like everyone talks about voting. It's all about the vote. It's not all about the voting, and the actual crafting of languages in the legislature, in the idea of how it impacts day-to-day lives is in the regulations. And guess what? All of those are put up in the federal regulations where anybody, Joe Blow, can put in and say, I don't like this and I think you should phrase it this way. And those are things where you can actually see individuals who have, because I've seen individual language that somebody has put in that actually made it into final regulations, which was how something was implemented. And they might be somebody who is a farmer down in Kansas who wrote it, and I'm like, that makes the most sense. And it actually can be put into the machine, the tool, and actually make a difference. But the idea of that kind of individual input into an entire government system isn't something that I tend to see very much beyond the idea of the vote. So I guess that's, you guys instead are just going to get my wish list of, hey, I'd like to see a little bit more of that kind of individual input, because those are the stories we want to see. And to some extent, those are things that do happen. We just don't get to hear about them very often.
I would totally read a science fiction novel about participatory budgeting. Just putting that out there.
Yeah, that's part of my job, is to make comments in the Federal Register.
Well, thank you all for this is the most interesting panel. I think we got into a little broader discussion than I thought we would. And I think looking at the chat run over here on the right, it looks like the audience was participating as well. We have 91 souls who are sticking with us. And for those, I would like to thank everybody that found the time to actually attend this, and hope you all had a good time.